In this video, we're going to focus on adding some more detail to the center of our steering wheel. When you look in the reference image, you'll notice that there are 6 buttons located at the center of the steering wheel. These buttons all have the same geometry and they are mirrored from the left side to the right side. So since we only have half of our steering wheel base drawn, we can create 3 of the buttons, and when we mirror the part to the left side, we'll go ahead and mirror that geometry as well. Let's start by creating a sketch on the front face of our steering wheel. The first thing we want to do is create a line for construction, loosely based at the center of the 2 outside buttons. We want to make this line parallel with the outside edge, and we want to give it a dimension. Looks like 60 millimeters is going to be pretty close to the reference image. Next, we want to add 3 circles at each endpoint and the midpoint of our newly drawn line. We want to give all 3 of these circles an equal relation and apply a 16 millimeter dimension to them. We want to go ahead and fix the endpoint of our construction line. That fixes all the geometry in place. We can exit the sketch and use the Curves dropdown from either our Features or our Surfaces tab to create a split line on the front face of our steering wheel base. This is going to break up the front face of our steering wheel with the 3 new buttons. The next feature we're going to use is the dome feature. Now it's important to note that the selection is going to drive the type of dome you create. For instance, if I select a single face, let's increase this to 2 millimeters, the dome looks nice and consistent. If we grab a secondary face, it alters the type of geometry that's being created. And you'll also notice with a single selection, you have the option to do an elliptical dome. For the purposes of this video, we're going to choose a 1 millimeter dimension. We're going to do a single selection, leaving the elliptical dome box deselected. Next, we're going to do a dome on each of the additional buttons that we created. And take a look at what we have. The next step is to create another sketch. This time, we need to create the illuminated ring. So we want to draw 3 circles. Again, these are going to be centered on the circles we already created for the buttons. And again, we're going to give them an equal relation with each other. We want to give them a dimension as well. In this case, I'm going to give it an offset dimension of 2 millimeters. We want to make sure that all of these are concentric with their associated buttons. Once we exit, we want to again use the split line. We want to select each of our buttons and hit OK. After we've created that dome that represents the button, you can see now we've got the illuminated ring section that will allow us to apply a lit LED material to that to show up in final renders as an illuminated button. Before we apply any decals, let's go ahead and create the split for the surrounding geometry of our button face. Let's go ahead and start a new sketch on the front face and start to draw geometry as closely as possible to the images. Now you'll note that I'm using all straight lines here. I want to make sure that I create a parallel relation and that everything is as close as possible to our reference image. We're going to go back and apply fillets to the corners, but I want to make sure that everything is appropriate. For instance, let's make a perpendicular relation between our parallel line and this upper edge. Next thing we want to do is close this sketch. We're going to need a closed profile to create a split line on the face of our steering wheel base. Ultimately, it doesn't matter as long as this line is inside the profile of our airbag, because eventually we're going to knit everything together or combine them if they're solids. Next, let's go ahead and apply some fillets. So we're going to use a sketch fillet option, starting at the bottom left, apply a 10 millimeter radius, move our way to the top right. 10 millimeter looks good there as well. Another thing we can do is make sure that these are concentric. It's going to make sure that our images are lined up. Again, we can do that at the bottom as well, make sure these are concentric, but this produces an error because of the size of our fillet radius. So if we undo that, we just need to be sure that everything looks as close as possible to our reference image. We can give offset dimensions based on this as well if we want to get it as close as possible. For our purposes, I'm going to give this a dimension from this line to this straight reference line, 6 millimeters. As I mentioned, this inside line doesn't necessarily matter as long as it's within the profile of our airbag. So let's give this a 25 millimeter length, and that will put that inside of our profile. And let's give this endpoint a dimension of 15.5 millimeters. And we want to give this an angle dimension, 135. That puts everything fairly close. The last thing we need to do is create a dimension for this line. Give it 11 millimeters. You could also add a parallel relation between this line and this line. That would fix it as well. Let's exit the sketch, again go to our Curves dropdown, use Split Line, create another split line on the face of our steering wheel. This gives us a section where we can change the material to replicate the material located on the face of our steering wheel image. We will have to take a look at reference images to be sure that we have the correct decals. Provided in the tutorial are decals for each of the buttons, which we'll go over in a future video. We also have reference images that will show you how the buttons are illuminated and how the decals are placed under each of those. These reference images are going to be important to make sure that we get the colors and the location of each button properly. That concludes creating buttons on our steering wheel base.